All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Fields, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies here on campus. Since you all are at this event, it's quite likely that you might be interested in some of the other events our center does. We have a few more events coming up this year. We'll have a full slate of programming next academic year. So I encourage you to visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu to see our upcoming events. And there's a little link at the bottom where you can join our mailing list. So if you're on campus, you can be notified of events like this before they happen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this first and very long delayed event in the CEAS Professional series. So this event was conceived in the before times in fall of 2019 as a way to bring to campus individuals who do work in East Asian studies, but who do so outside of the context of a university. All right, not that there's anything wrong with universities. We all love universities. But we were hoping that this series can diversify our programming by highlighting authors, journalists, policymakers, filmmakers who do serious work in East Asian studies, but who do so outside of the context of an academic community. We also hope that this series will inform our students on the variety of careers and opportunities that are available to them with their East Asian studies knowledge and credentials. And we're so delighted that our inaugural guest in this series was so willing to spend a great deal of time over the last 2 days doing visits to classes, meeting with students, undergraduate and undergraduates, to discuss his own path in from Madison to the career that he is now in. We hope to offer many more such opportunities in this professional series in the future. In fact, we're already in dialogue with the potential speaker for next fall, which we are very excited about. So please stay tuned for an announcement on that, hopefully in the coming weeks. It's now my pleasure to welcome Junko Mori, Professor of Japanese Linguistics in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, to introduce our guest this afternoon. Please help me welcome Professor Mori.
Hi, thank you, David. So I'm Junko Mori from Asian Languages and Cultures. So it is my great pleasure to welcome back Mr. Matt Out, UW-Madison Japanese Program alum, and introduce him as a speaker, the first speaker of the CEAS Professional series. So I was a member of the center's steering committee a few years ago when we were discussing the ideas for this series. And immediately, Alto-san's name came to my mind, and so as a candidate for this series. And I was glad that the center agreed that this is a great idea, and then supported and made this come true. So Alto-san attended UW-Madison from 91 to 95, majoring in Japanese and international relations. I first met him in the third semester Japanese classroom, where I served as a graduate teaching assistant under the late Professor Miura Akira. So Alto-san was one of the most memorable students from that era. Back then, at the peak of Japanese economy, the majority of students who joined the Japanese classroom were interested in Japan's business, science, and technology. Among them, Alto-san stood out as he was always talking about his interest in Godzilla, manga, and games. In hindsight, he was ahead of his time, but we, the instructor at the time, were like, what is this kid doing in the university classroom? But I also remember, though, he was a serious learner of Japanese in his own creative and fun-loving ways. And so we both left Madison in the mid-90s, and for many years I didn't know where he went and what he did after the graduation. Then, one day in March 2011, I saw him on TV, being interviewed by a newscaster about his experience in Tokyo after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. And during the first half of the segment, I was just listening to this random American guy who's living in Japan. But then I saw the name, Matt Out. Matt Out. Matt Out? Out? is that him? Really? And then so I quickly did the Google search. And yes, there he was. So he was co-founded AltJapan and working on translations and localizations and writing about yokai and pop culture, etc., etc. So since then, I have read his beautifully written articles in the New Yorker, such as Podcasts from Japan, Why I Stayed, How Emoji Got into the White House, Godzilla Returns. Oh yeah, there is Godzilla again. And then the United States of Japan, blah, blah, blah. And the most recent one is the Demon Slayer. I need to wear the glasses. The visual, viral blockbuster from Japan. And I also watched him introducing various elements of Japanese culture and society in the NHK World Television series, show Japanology Plus, and from covering from Japanese sword to creation of premium Japanese beef to traditional bathhouse, sento, and then we finally reunited in Tokyo in 2013, and he kindly showed myself and my husband around in his neighborhood of Kichijoji, which is now his hometown. And then after that, one winter, when my husband and I visited his old friend in Florida, this person said something like, "Have you read the most recent piece by Matt Alt in the New Yorker?
God.
You shouldn't. If you haven't, you should. Boy, he is a great writer." Oh. And with my husband and I were like, with a grin in my face, I replied, "Yes, of course." And in fact, we met him, we know him, and he is an alum of our Japanese program. So that was such a proud moment for myself. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor to Mr. Matt Alt, who will present his talk entitled Pure Invention, How Japan's Pop Culture Made the Modern World and Why It Matters. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. That's a very tough act to follow. How do you follow one's idealized self? It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for coming on this rainy afternoon. This is my first time on campus in close to 25 years. And I remember it, and I remember my time with Professor Mori very fondly. But today we're here to talk about my book, which is called Pure Invention, How Japan Made the Modern World. And before we no worries, come on in. And before we get into the meat of it, I want to talk a little bit about the cultural background of the times that we find ourselves living in. Because times are strange right now. We are simultaneously more interconnected than ever before, yet lonelier than ever. The goalposts of adulthood seem to keep getting moved further and further out to the point where young generations are even using words like adulting to describe how they just feel like they're going through the motions. In times of old, we used to consume content made by giant corporations. Now we make content for giant corporations through our own user-generated material, and we are our own brands in many ways. When things get too hectic, we cocoon ourselves in virtual spaces to nourish ourselves from the stresses of real life, such as Animal Crossing, a Nintendo game that was the biggest selling game of 2020, a very surprise hit of the early COVID era. We have gamified the very fundamental aspects of the human condition, likes, views. The very ways that we interact with each other traditionally have now become another form of data that's used to analyze us, and even a currency in their own right. There's a sense that the best days are behind us, that the economic good times have ended. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of grievance, and this has given rise to very strange new movements and cyber religions. It would be tempting to describe each and every one of these phenomena as simply figments of the strange, late capitalist post-industrial times that we find ourselves in. But what if I told you that each and every one of these had a precursor in Japan, decades before they happened in the West? From parasite singles, young adults who could not or would not leave the nest and were vilified for that by the mass media in the way that many millennials are today. Now we spend most of our lives with our faces buried in cell phones and looking at screens. And the precursor of that is the Walkman, a device that was the first gadget that let us put a fast forward on life and cocoon ourselves in our own personal media spheres. Many of the aspects of digital life and digital communications that we take for granted today, such as emojis or the concept of trading faces in books, these too were pioneered on the streets of Japan in the 1990s, mainly by young women. We'll get into that. Strange new social phenomenon like people who define themselves by the pop culture they consume. Those were called otaku in Japan. We now know it in different forms in America today, such as identity politics. Or hikikomori, people who have given up on society to the point where they don't leave home at all. The ideas that a giant economic apocalypse has reshaped society. In Japan, which was flying high in the 1980s during an economic bubble, it popped in 1990, ushering in a period of time known now as the lost decades. America is living a sort of lost decades of its own in the post-Lehman era. And many of the phenomena that we see happening among young people and old today are echoes of the same sorts of things that happen in Japan. Even scary things like QAnon, which can arguably be called a descendant of a very similar techno-oriented cult known as Aum Supreme that engineered a really terrifying attack on the Japanese subway system in 1995. It too recruited disaffected elite people and disaffected people using bulletin board systems, primitive dial-up bulletin board systems of the day. So you can see there are many sorts of these echoes of things that happened in Japan during the lost decades, when supposedly Japan was going to slide into irrelevance because it was no longer a financial empire anymore, and things that are happening in our lives right now. So what is happening in Japan is not something that's happening or has happened in a distant land. In a very real way, it's things that have happened and are happening to us. That's the sort of background for my book, which I wrote over the course of 2018 and 19, and it came out in 2020 with astounding timing right in the middle of COVID-19, which is why you may not have heard of it until quite recently, because this is actually the very first live event that I am giving for this book, which is kind of unheard of when you have a major book release. Usually you go on a book tour and you go around and you talk to people and stuff. That was all over Zoom. So it's nice to see actual human faces for a change. Normally I'm sitting in my underwear looking at a computer screen. So, Pure Invention. First of all, what is Pure Invention? Pure Invention is a quote. I took it from a great Irish playwright who was active in England, London, at the turn of the 20th century, named Oscar Wilde. And he made a acerbic remark that the whole of Japan is a pure invention. There is no such country. There are no such people. The Japanese people are simply a mode of style, an exquisite fancy of art. Now this seems like a kind of nasty thing to say, but in fact, Mr. Wilde was not really talking about the Japanese at all. He was a very, very intellectual, well-traveled, international person. He knew full well that across the ocean there was a thriving country of people going about their lives in much the same way that Britons and Americans were in their own countries. He was talking about us, Westerners, and our view of Japan, which in the late Victorian period was of a fantasy land. This was a period of time where there was a fad known as Japanism that was sweeping both Europe and America. After American gunboats opened up Japanese ports to the world in the 1850s, they were undoubtedly expecting to find an impoverished nation ripe for exploitation. Instead, what they found was a thriving country that had a thriving pop culture and was producing large amounts of arts and crafts that turned out to be major exports in the decades to come. Art in the form of woodblock prints and scrolls deeply influenced the Impressionists. I love this painting by Van Gogh of, I believe it's one of his doctors. But if you look at the background, he's posed this gentleman against the wall in Van Gogh's own house that is plastered with woodblock prints. It is really tempting to think of him as similar to the young people today who plaster their rooms with anime posters or images from manga. This sort of art went and transformed, really, the image of what art could be in the West. And you start to see things like these beautiful posters that came out of Paris at the turn of the century that are also deeply influenced by woodblock prints. But it wasn't just about art. Tiffany's in the 1870s was a humble emporium of just random goods until things from Japan started to come in and transform the meaning of what it meant to be cultured and sophisticated. Charles Tiffany actually announced that he was going to make products more Japanese than the Japanese himself, and then actually proved it by using motifs from Hokusai, Hiroshige, and other Japanese artists to create groundbreaking hit products like this classic Tiffany's lamp, which uses Hokusai imagery for the dragonflies around the base. And so too did Japan begin to influence pop culture in the form of Gilbert and Sullivan plays and things like this. This sort of image of Japan as this wonderland that possessed values that Westerners thought that they had lost in their drive to modernization is precisely the kind of combination of looking up at and looking down at the Japanese that Oscar Wilde was making fun of with his comment about Japan being pure invention. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, if everybody loved Japan so much in the 1870s through the 1930s, which is a pretty serious chunk of time, what happened? Well, the short answer to that is war happened. War happened. It took a world war to derail the West's love affair with Japan. We all know how that ended, not well. And for many years after the war, Japan was seen as this kind of also-ran, this loser. These are quotes from the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, that suicide is not an illogical step for anyone concerned with Japan's economic future. This is the Secretary of State of the United States saying this. I love the next one. We're at I believe, a cocktail soiree with the Prime Minister of Japan. He said, you shouldn't expect to find any kind of market for your products in the United States because, the Japanese don't make the things that we want. They never have, never will. Obviously, Mr. Dulles was not a fan of Japanism or did not remember what had happened in the decades before World War II, but he was just as equally wrong about this. It took a very short time to prove him wrong, as a flood of really well-made products, starting with things like transistor radios, started to enter the American and European marketplaces over the decades to come, and quickly transformed Japan from this defeated husk of a nation into an economic tiger. So by the 1970s, when I was born, and the 1980s, when I was being raised, it wasn't at all uncommon to turn on the TV and see ostensible adults smashing all sorts of Japanese products on the steps of Congress, out in the streets, protesting Japan, because Japanese products had begun disrupting cherished American industries, electronics, cars, you name it. Pretty soon, we were framing Japan as invaders again. Not military invaders, but economic invaders. And you couldn't even escape it in pop culture. I'd go to a movie theater, this is from one of my favorite films, Blade Runner. Blade Runner is set in the far-flung year of 2019 in Los Angeles. That doesn't look very much like the Los Angeles we know. It looks a lot more like Tokyo, with giant billboards featuring geisha popping sex enhancement pills and everybody speaking Japanese on the streets. This is the future that the adults in the room were telling us kids in the 80s that we would have to look forward to, ruled by corporate overlords who would be owning the entire planet by the time we grew up. It sounds like a kind of moment for a lot of recollection and kind of scariness, a lot of fear. But for us kids, it was just kind of a head-scratching moment. Because for us, Japan was never an invader. It was where all the stuff we loved came from. The Nintendos, the Power Rangers, the Gundams, the anime, the manga. While the adults were fretting about Japanese imports disrupting marketplaces, they didn't stop to think about the fact that Japanese fantasies would be disrupting our fantasies in the process. These products, these toys, these cartoons, as we consumed them, they transformed us. and they transformed our image of Japan in the process. So where are we today? Well, today, this is from 2015, so it's not exactly today, we have a scene of the President of the United States on the White House lawn thanking the Japanese for inventing karaoke and emoji and anime. It really makes you wonder, what would FDR think of this? I mean, this is a crazy, crazy moment in US-Japan relations. You know, you could call it a transformation, you could call it coming full circle, but one thing is for certain, it is an unbelievable image transformation, almost unprecedented in human history, to go from public enemy number one into the forge of the planet's fantasies. There's actually a term for this, the underlying sort of concept of why this happened. It is called soft power. Soft power is a term that was coined by the Harvard professor Joseph Nye, and he uses it as a corollary to hard power. Hard power is exactly what we think it is. You don't do what we want, we're going to roll the tanks in. You don't do what we want, we're going to economic sanctions. It is about carrots and sticks. It is about compelling the other side to do what you want it to do in a negotiation or diplomacy. Soft power, on the other hand, is much more of a passive sort of thing. You could think of it as perhaps a nation's gross national charisma. It means to get your opponent to want the same outcomes you do because they like you. Because they like you. They like your values, they like the stuff you make, they like your culture, they like your politics, etc., etc. For a long time, America occupied the role of having the most soft power on the planet, and it still does have a lot. Hollywood, rap music, sports, we still charm people all over the globe. But the way that Japan has risen from literally nothing to become this forge of fantasies for the entire planet is not only unprecedented, it is a textbook example of soft power. Now, the trick with soft power is, and this often trips people up, it can't actively really be exploited. It is a grassroots sort of phenomenon. When we like Japan, it's because we like the stuff it makes. It's not because politicians are legislating. You can't really take this and actively use it, which is why a lot of politicians out there say it doesn't really exist, or it's not really pertinent or useful to the dialogue. But as we've seen with Japan, that's definitely not the case. We have a situation where a country that by all means should have become irrelevant after it lost its economic pole position actually became more so because of its cultural products. Now, as to why I became interested in this, it's because I co-founded and co-operate what is called a localization company. Localization is a $5 word for translation. It refers to the translation of entertainment products for consumption in foreign markets. The reason we call it localization and not translation is because it often involves a lot of modification of the content to make it suitable for audiences abroad or to make it more palatable for audiences abroad. The trick is, because this is entertainment, it's not something that's like a instruction manual. You want the user to be able to consume it in a way that is as stress-free as possible, almost as if it was made for them in the first place. In the early years when we started doing this around the turn of the millennium, about 20 years back, we often had to make quite a few changes to the products, which we would do in concert with the creators, the producers, the directors of things like video games, comic books, toys, and literature. And the reason we had to do this was because people just simply either wouldn't understand things, or there'd be cultural hurdles, or what have you. And it was really interesting. It gave us a seat at the table, where fantasies were actually made, where new ideas sparked to life, where new products jumped into existence. And it kind of put us in the beating heart of Japan's pop cultural machine. It was a very privileged place to be. Most people don't get to see in there, even if you're in Japan, to be at the table with these people. But as the years went on, and particularly after the 2010s, I started to notice something, which is that the consumers abroad didn't want changes made to the products. Not only do they not want the changes made, they want things as authentic as possible, they wanted them as fast as possible, they wanted them as Japanese as possible. And at first I was like, wow, okay, well, what's up with that? Is this some kind of new wave Japanism? Are these just some kind of diehard fans who've suddenly become like a kind of cult movement? And then I realized I was asking the wrong questions. The real question wasn't why these kids wanted this material this way. I realized that these kids had come to resemble the Japanese who had made these products themselves. And by kids, it's not just kids, it's adults too. It's consumers of all sorts of products of things Japanese. And that is the basis of what I was thinking when I wrote this book. Pure Invention is a cultural detective story. I decided to tell this story of how our taste Japanized, how the world Japanized through our consumption of things Japanese through the lens of consumer products. I tracked down the seminal initial manifestations of a series of key inventions, products, that proved really pivotal in this shift in the way that we looked at the world, the way that we looked at ourselves, and the way we looked at Japan. I found the very first toy that was made in Japan in December of 1945, the very first product of any kind made in Japan. And I think it's very telling that it was a toy, not something that was more necessary. I found the very first karaoke machine and interviewed its elderly creator. The very first Hello Kitty product, the very first Walkman, some of the very first anime to hit big in the West, the first video games to truly become a form of lifestyle, and new forms of digital communication in the form of emoji and in anonymous bulletin board systems, which began roiling Japanese society and politics decades before the same began happening here. But I didn't just randomly pick hit products. I wanted to drill down on a very specific type of item that had the ability to nourish our imaginations and stoke our fantasies as we consume them. I call them fantasy delivery devices. And each one of the chapters in my book is anchored by the story of one of them. To be considered a fantasy delivery device, I came up with a quick calculus called the 3 ins. A product had to be inessential. We had to buy it because we wanted it, not because we needed it. If you have to buy something because you need it, that overrides any other reasons why you would get it. If you buy something because you want it, it's a totally different calculus. They had to be inescapable. They had to be big hits because they had to be everywhere and you had to be confronted with them to know what was going on. And most importantly, they had to be influential. By influential, I mean they had to transform the way that we saw the world or the way we saw Japan, or in most cases, both. Now here's an example for you. I put the Nintendo Entertainment System in my book. It's one of the key chapters, in fact. What isn't in my book is a VCR. VCRs were made in Japan and exported to the West in positively massive numbers in the 1980s and early 1990s. But they aren't fantasy delivery devices. Because when we bought VCRs, we used them to consume our own Hollywood fantasies or television shows. Nobody using a VCR thought, hey, wow, Japan, you know, what a great country. On the other hand, when you purchased a Nintendo or a Game Boy, particularly in those early years, you were compelled to consume content that was made in Japan for Japanese audiences, and by doing so, your own tastes transformed and came in line with theirs. So Game Boys not only changed the way that we lived by allowing us to game on the go, which is something people do all the time now, but they also introduced us to all sorts of subconscious, subliminal aspects of Japanese culture that their creators wove into the games as we were playing them. So for the second part of this lecture, how many minutes are we in here now? 29. So we have another 10 or 15 minutes here. I wanted to go into a couple of concrete examples of stuff from the book and things that you might know of, but you might be a little bit shocked at how they developed over the years and how they impact our lives today. One of the first ones I want to talk about is anime. So the very first anime show aired in 1963 in Japan. There had been cartoons before that, of course. And Japan actually was a thriving market for imported cartoons like the Flintstones and Popeye. But Astro Boy, aired in 1963, was the very first domestically produced Japanese cartoon. It was the brainchild of a medical doctor turned artist by the name of Osamu Tezuka, extraordinarily prolific. And he coined the term anime to refer to domestically produced cartoons as a foil to the imported ones that were coming in. And from the very moments of this very first anime, you can see scenes of protest in the streets. The very first episode, it's all about a little robot boy who escapes from a circus and becomes a kind of a superhero fighting for justice. A very simple sort of plot. But by the end of the first episode, he's leading his fellow robots in not quite a rebellion, but a demonstration on the streets demanding equal rights. This was all playing out against the backdrop of a great deal of anti-war and labor protests that were happening in Japan at the time. And it was obvious to early observers, not only kids to who ate this up because it was the first cartoon made just for them, but when it was exported abroad, Tezuka's brainchild actually attracted the attention of quite a few tastemakers, such as this letter here is actually from Stanley Kubrick, who after seeing an episode of Astro Boy, sent a letter, registered mail it looks like, from New York City asking Mr. Tezuka to please join him and help make the designs for a science fiction movie that he was planning to take place at the turn of the millennium. Mr. Tezuka was too busy, unfortunately, but it's tempting to wonder what 2001: A Space Odyssey would have turned out with this kind of cartoony sensibility to it. So cartoons in Japan and manga and anime have always had this air of rebellion and protest to them. It's one of the fundamental differences between them and things made, for instance, by Disney and places like that. By the end of the 1960s, manga and anime had been honed into an absolutely new form of graphic entertainment known as Gekiga in Japan that featured adult protagonists and adult situations. And these works, such as Tomorrow's Joe, which is about a boxer who fights his way up from poverty into becoming the top boxer in all of Japan, nourished student revolutionary movements. You can see them here. These are anti-war protesters, and even led to extremist movements, such as the Japan Red Army, a terrorist group who hijacked a plane to North Korea in 1971, and their only missive to the press was, "We are tomorrow's Joe," taking a manga as their sort of symbol. We see this adolescent rebellion in all sorts of consumption of Japanese manga and anime today. We'll get into some little bit more details of that later on. But before I do that, I want to talk about an invention that you might be very familiar with, karaoke. This is another chapter. Karaoke seems so inessential, so useless, but it's such a part of our lives, or at least it was in the late 20th century and early 21st. This is actually my father-in-law. I found this photograph of him. Check this out. He's singing on an 8-track machine. I don't know if any of you kids know what that is, but it's a tape. You had to put it in. You couldn't stream it. Back in time, you had to listen to music on like media and stuff. This is an early 1970s, mid-1970s karaoke room in Japan. I tracked down this gentleman, Mr. Negishi, now 97 years old, still going strong. He invented the very first karaoke machine in 1967 in this very room, in fact, in this very house. After I was interviewing him, realized this is where the first karaoke party in history had ever been held. And he's showing me his 8-track tapes. There was no screen with words going across it. You had to look in a little book. But this guy, he was so great. And over the course of this book, I interviewed many people like this, who were very happy to share the stories of how their inventions changed the world. Okay, great, karaoke. I found the first karaoke machine. Who cares? Well, karaoke was actually the progenitor of a lot of things that we take for granted today. It was the first device to make rank amateurs feel like pros for at least the duration of a song. The songs were re-recorded in slower tempos and simpler keys, kind of subtly, so you thought you were singing well. And the microphones had things like reverb in them to cover the fact that most of us have really, really horrible voices. You can think of karaoke as one of the early examples of user-generated content. It's the democratization of celebrity. You know, suddenly you don't have to be on TV to have a room full of people listening to you. You can force them to listen to you because it's your turn to sing on the karaoke song. And there's something even more. Karaoke was big in the West, but it was never as big here as it was in Japan. Karaoke was a huge driver of technological innovation there because they needed better technologies to serve up these songs to people. Another person I spoke to is this gentleman on the left, Mr. Yasutomo. Mr. Yasutomo was a plasma physicist who came up with the very first way to digitize karaoke songs and transmit them over phone lines in the early mid-1990s. He basically created the world's first streaming music service, decades before Spotify or any of the YouTube or any of the things we take for granted today. Of course, it was slow. The music was, as he called it, plinky. It used a form of music sampling called MIDI, which is like beeps and boops, almost like a phone. But people loved it because they could sing hot songs in real time. Until this moment, you had to wait for a laser disc to be pressed or an 8-track to be recorded. There was a huge lag between when a song hit and when people were able to sing it. But thanks to this, you could just program it in right away. And this had all sorts of profoundly transformative effects on the Japanese music industry. It turned out that by serving up this music in real time, each choice of a song turned into essentially a vote. You could use that to see what songs were popular in real time, which is something no music producer had ever been able to do before. And what happened? Music producers began to produce songs that were easier to sing. It basically ended up dumbing down the Japanese pop music industry because to the lowest common denominator, like that old Kurt Vonnegut story, Harrison Bergeron, nobody could be a better singer than anybody else because then it wouldn't, if you made a song that was sung by a diva that sounded really beautiful but nobody could sing it, they wouldn't choose it at karaoke, and that's where all the royalties were coming in from. In fact, this choice back in 1992 is one of the reasons that K-pop has lapped J-pop in the global consciousness, because the songs in Japan, because big data came into effect, it actually was kind of a curse. This democratization of music singing, basically by prioritizing everybody, shut out the real big talents who might have made like a huge impression on the scene. So these are just two examples of products from the book. I think we're starting to hit up against, do I have time for another? Do I have time? Okay, great, I have time for another. I'm so bad at keeping track of time. I will stay up here for hours talking about this. I will read the book out loud if you let me. So anyway, that's karaoke. I have a bunch of other examples here, but I want to jump back to anime for a very specific reason, which is, we were talking about anime before. At the turn of the 21st century, an anonymous bulletin board system called 2-Channel opened up in Japan. It was a dial-up bulletin board, and it was fueled by the fact that Japan had one of the earliest working mobile internet systems on its cell phones at the time. Millions of Japanese onboarded onto the internet, and they found this website, which was basically a kind of clearinghouse for young people to find their tribes and to share their love for all sorts of things Japanese pop cultural. But it was the internet, so you could really access it from anywhere if you could find it, and that's precisely what happened. Several years later, a bunch of teenaged anime fans came around, they saw this website, and they founded a website of their own called 4chan, which is a kind of joke off the 2-Channel, which is the original Japanese one. 4chan, this is one of its earliest, you might have heard of this from the headlines, this is one of its earliest incarnations, and you can see its boards are all anime, video games. Most of the things that people were talking, there's all sorts of words on here that are just taken straight from Japanese. It was a sort of festival and celebration of things for people who loved things from Japan. And just like 2-Channel, it let people find their tribes. But very quickly, because it was anonymous and because it rewarded extreme forms of expression and behavior, it became a breeding ground for all sorts of really vile expressions and content. By the time of 2016, all of these young anime fans had gone openly political. Things like Pizzagate, things like Gamergate became huge topics of discussion. The springboards were on 4chan, in a place that had originally been founded as a sort of utopian love-in for things from Japan. And as the board filled with kids who felt that they couldn't thrive as adults anymore in the wake of the Lehman shock, in the wake of the Great Recession that was happening, got angry and began trolling each other and then began trolling the mass media, suddenly you started to see strange mashups of anime and political stars, rising political stars at the time, like these, which Japanese people have no concept of what's going on here. These are Japanese otaku, these are Japanese fans, these are American fans of Japanese stuff on this anonymous bulletin board system in the West. To the point where we had this glorious moment on MSNBC where this GOP strategist calls Trump supporters childless single men who masturbate to anime. This is on like the mainstream news. It is like the most specific example I can think of how the streams have been crossed between Japanese fantasies and Western and manifesting in totally different ways in a very similar, economically apocalyptic landscape that we were experiencing in the West. It wasn't just limited to people on the right. On the left, the Women's March on Washington, held shortly after Trump took office, it turned the mall in Washington into the sea of these pink pussy hats, which were modeled on Sanrio, Hello Kitty, super cute sorts of imagery that women were using no longer as a symbol of childishness, but a symbol of female power. When I actually interviewed the woman who co-created these hats, Krista Suh, she said that she had, quote unquote, been raised in Sanrio shops as a child, almost like Mowgli in the Jungle Book. And these Sanrio sorts of, these Japanese sorts of fantasies are now being filtered back into becoming tools that we use to navigate a very difficult sort of landscape that we're all facing in the 21st century. It's actually not just Americans. Anime and manga are forms of protest now in places like Thailand, in places like Hong Kong, where characters from famous shows are being used to speak truth to power and express anger at the system. And it's, tempting to look at this and just think of how childish these people are for using this imagery. But then you think back to what was going on with Astro Boy, and the very first episode ended with robots taking to the street and demanding equality. So there's something about Japanese illustrated entertainment that really hits a sort of adolescent, rebellious sweet spot that people find useful for all sorts of contexts outside of its original creation in Japan. Just another example of soft power manifesting in unexpected ways all across the globe. Now, I can really go on all night long if you let me here, so I'm like kind of looking over for some, I could turn the floor open for some sorts of questions. What I will preempt one thing. People often ask me, well, if Japan was so ahead of the curve in the 20th century and the early 21st century, well, where is it now? What's coming out of Japan now that's going to, transform the planet? And to which I would answer that, we've all synchronized. We've all synchronized in the kind of post-COVID era. The culture is kind of, in a certain sense, ground to a stop. But because we have consumed so many fantasies from Japan, what you are going to see in the future is no longer that the future is made in Japan, but the future is made everywhere else by other people with sensibilities borrowed from Japan. These are just 4 examples of this. This up the upper left here, this is a game called Pokemon Go. You've probably heard of it, in 2016. This isn't from Japan. This is made in Silicon Valley. They just skinned this application with Pokemon characters to make it more appealing to people abroad. On the right is a video game called Ghost of Tsushima. It's like a Japanese period drama. It looks like it's a video game, but it looks like something Akira Kurosawa directed. It's made by Americans, 100%. I don't think there's no Japanese were harmed in the making of this video game. On the bottom, you have a game called Genshin Impact. This is a Chinese mobile game that is unabashedly borrowing Japanese-style imagery and kind of puts the lie to the impression that China and Japan hate each other. I think it's more the case that their governments are feuding with each other because people from Japan and China love interacting and borrowing things from each other, as you can see here. And then this is another example, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. This game is inspired by a Japanese movie called Battle Royale, but it's made by Koreans. It's made by a Korean video game director. So you're seeing these tastes being borrowed from Japan and manifesting. These are just video games, but there's all sorts of other examples of this. And it's just another way that you can see of how all of our tastes have turned a little bit more Japanese in the decades since World War II. So that's it for now. I can keep going, but that's it for now. But let's, yes. I'd like to open the floor up for a few questions. Anybody have anything? If you don't, I'm just going to keep going. You don't want me to keep going? Yes.
I've got a list. I'll try to keep them.
Excellent.
So, would you say then, do you think that we're over-romanticizing Japan? For those of us who haven't been there, who really want to go there, we see these things, we really want to experience this stuff. Do you think that should the opportunity come that we get there, that we go, oh, no, this isn't, I hope not.
Maybe I can answer that with a slide. Yes, you are. Yes and no. Okay, so where is Japan today in the global imagination? Yeah, it's a forge of fantasies, but we're not looking for the exact same sorts of fantasies anymore, are we? When I was a kid, I was looking for giant monsters stomping cities, robots blowing each other up, anime, all the sorts of great stuff that we associate with, post-war Japanese pop culture. But today, it's no longer just kids who are consuming stuff from Japan, it's adults. And one of the biggest things, one of Japan's arguably biggest exports is meditative content of all types. Marie Kondo is the flagship of this sort of thing. She's exporting this sort of fantasy of a uncluttered, simplified lifestyle. Although, if you think about it, if Japan is such a simplified, uncluttered place, why did they create a Marie Kondo in the first place? The answer is because Marie Kondo, like all of the fantasy delivery devices in my book, wasn't actually made for us. None of the products I talk about, from Karaoke to Nintendo, the emoji, they weren't made with export in mind. They were made for Japanese people. They were made to solve problems in Japan that were often happening in Japan a little bit ahead of the rest of us. So when they hit the West, we're like, wow, where did this come from? I needed a Marie Kondo to help me organize my sock drawer, say thank you to my underwear before I throw it away. It's not just Marie Kondo. There's all sorts of things like the Japanese way of forest bathing, or kintsugi, which is a term from Japanese traditional ceramics. When you shatter something, you can actually use a kind of gold compound to glue it back together, and many people find it more beautiful repaired that way, and this person is using it in a kind of self-help guide kind of way. Or the famed ikigai, which just means kind of finding your, raison d'etre in life. And here it's being used by a couple of foreign people, I think is very key. Hector Garcia and his friend Fransek. It's interesting because ikigai in Japanese is not actually being used in any kind of self-help way. I mean, it can be, you can take great pleasure in your life as a serial killer too, and nobody is going to be, that's your ikigai if that's what you are. But this here, it's an example of how we're looking now to Japan as a country that has grappled with the problems of post-industrial, late capitalist societies a little ahead of the curve, and might have, if not all the answers, a little bit more experience in dealing with them. Because we really have come to resemble Japan in so many ways. Demographically, we're aging. We're an aging, all Western advanced nations are aging. In Japan, adult diapers have been outselling baby diapers since 2011. That's how aged and how few babies are being born there. There's the economic precarity. Japan has been in a precarious position since the 1990s with its lost decades. And as I said earlier, we are in a period of economic precarity in the post-Lehman era. And then, politically, chaos. Japan has been going through prime minister after prime minister. Abe was the prime minister. Abe of the last few years was the only person to hold kind of a really a long run in there. 14 prime ministers came and went between around 1990 and 2005. It's crazy. So you have no leadership at the top, or no reliable leadership at the top. You have a lot of people who are really worried about what's going on, right? And you have the society that's losing its dynamism in many ways, because young people, children, are what drive, their economic drivers for the growth of nations. Japan's been wrestling with this for a long time, so we do romanticize it, but it's also true that they made these things. And because they made them for themselves, they have an air of authenticity to them that things that are made for us and marketed to us don't. Because people can sniff out BS really, really easily. If something is being marketed to you, if you're being sold a line, one of the other big reasons that we love stuff from Japan so much is because it feels so real. What is this Studio Ghibli stuff? What is this guy saying? Haruki Murakami, who's he writing? This feels like he's writing just for me. All of this stuff. And it's precisely because it wasn't written for us that we can approach it in this way where it feels really real. So there is a fantasy at play here. There is a reality at play. But that's just, that's postmodernism in a nutshell, isn't it? Yes.
What made you realize you wanted to get into localization? When was that?
Well, when I was a kid, I played a lot of video games. And especially back in the 80s and 90s, all of us, we were struck by how beautiful these games were, how the virtual environments popped, and how the characters looked so great, and how much effort was put into making these experiences, and how shitty the translations were. Oh my God. Oh my God, like all your base belonged to us. That's a classic one. Or A Winner Is You. That was when you won the pro wrestling game on the NES, that was what it said, A Winner Is You. And even at age like 13 or 14, you're like, man, I could do better. And so that was part of it. But of course, as I went to, that wasn't the reason I started to major in Japanese. But when I majored in Japanese, I worked as a translator after graduating from the UW in 1995. I worked for many years in the Patent and Trademark Office, and then I was actively looking for opportunities to get into gaming, and that did happen at the end of the 20th century, and that coincided with a kind of moment where all of us from that early Nintendo era had grown up into adults and could start changing the industry. So up until that point, the word localization wasn't even a term. When Hiroko and I my wife, first started using it in our company, we had to even explain to the video game companies, well, it's like translation, but it's not like that crappy stuff you did before. We went a little more politely than that. But yes, so it was really driven by, in a certain sense, I don't want to say grievance, because I wasn't angry about it, but frustration, dissatisfaction. Frustration and dissatisfaction can be great drivers of innovation if you know how to channel it well. So it's that's what led to that. A winner is me. Yes.
What would you say are some negative aspects that were exported in this exportation of Japanese? For example, like, to me, what can come to mind is like the fetishization of young females, for example. The age of consent in Japan is 13.
Yes.
So like aspects like that are in this media as well, and then with that being exported.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a slide of this here, but one of the first pieces I did for the New Yorker was about a video done by Pharrell Williams called "It Girl." It was a hit song. It wasn't as big as like, what was his first big hit? Happy? Happy, right? It came out, it was like the B-side of Happy. It was a hit song. It's a cool song. And that video features a lot of the kind of imagery you're talking about because he outsourced it to a Japanese artist named Takashi Murakami, who's famed for his Superflat collective. And Murakami outsourced it to one of his guys who specializes in exactly that kind of art. And when this video hit YouTube, I guess there wasn't any MTV by this point, I was really shocked by these underage girls cavorting here underneath the lyrics of, he's like, I'm gonna touch your ass, all the kind of classic kind of lines you hear in a rap soul love song. And so I wrote this piece exploring where this came from. And it was it's really interesting because that art comes from a sort of troll in Japanese pop culture of the 1980s, because female artists were becoming so dominant in the manga industry back then. There was a kind of splinter group of aggrieved male artists who began trolling them by making these underage girl comics and creations. In a real way, it's a sort of version of 4chan's trolling that happened in the pages of comic books and anime instead of on the video screen. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff has become ingrained in Japanese illustrated culture. Fortunately, it's only one strain of it, But in another way you can say it's also kind of adds to the sort of vibrancy of anime and manga, as gross as it is, as unsettling as it is, because one of the things that sets Japanese illustrated entertainment aside from that of other nations is that it is so freeform, anything goes, as long as it sells. And because of that, you, on the shadows, have a lot of really creepy content that is kind of lurking there and can be exploited by bad actors, which is what happened when 4chan found it and started injecting it into political memes and all sorts of stuff during the 2016 elections. So this is another aspect of soft power. It can't really be controlled. When you put something out there, it's out there. And the way consumers consume it is something that it's out of the hands even of its creators. So yes, there's definitely negative aspects to this. Anime has played a part in some really kind of weird movements, both in Japan and in the West, and anime fans. That doesn't mean anime is bad or manga is bad. It just means a subset of people are identifying with grotesque or extreme forms of expression within that large genre. Because, movies, there's some pretty crazy, wild, sick movies out there too, ranging from everything from pornography and snuff films or whatever. But if somebody consumes that, you don't say, well, movies, we're going to get rid of that. So it's just kind of a testament to how broad and deep those forms of expression are, as well as, how they contribute to some kind of weirdness, culturally speaking, all around the world. Oh, I wasn't expecting to talk about Lolicon today. Yes. Yes? Did I say yes? Hannah? Yes.
I think recently people have been noticing like K-pop and like Korean cultural soft power like emerging, but it seems to be like characteristically a little different since like a lot of it is government fiction and like industrialized for a foreign audience. Do you see like a similar impact on Western audiences that like Japanese subculture has had?
So, it's tempting to frame the K-pop versus J-pop thing in kind of antagonistic terms, first of all. And you're not, but I'm just saying a lot of people do. And to that, I say soft power is not a zero-sum game. There is room for, the potential of imagination is limitless. It's infinite. So there's enough room out there to love J-pop and K-pop at the same time. They aren't antagonists to one another. But the big difference between Japan and Korea is that Korean leaders have realized that this is soft power, and they are desperately trying to exploit it. But it's interesting because if you look at giant hits like, for instance, Parasite is this film that really exposes the inequities in Korean society. It's a great, genius film. It's hard for me to imagine why a politician would be like, yes, this is so great. Look at all these poor people who are suffering in our country. But it's great art because it wasn't made. The reason we like it is it wasn't made as propaganda. It was made by an artist who was trying to share his own vision. Now, the Korean government is trying to hop on board with this, and they're doing all sorts of promotional efforts. And, that's fine and great, but you cannot dictate what people will like. If you could, every book would be a massive hit. Every movie would be a massive hit. BTS has to make its own hit songs. They have to find their own audience abroad. Now, can that be exploited? Can that be used? To a degree. But the problem is if BTS becomes a mouthpiece of the Korean government, well, suddenly it's not really cool anymore, is it? It's just like another form of propaganda. And they're not. I'm just saying if they did. So it's a really interesting question. Japan has, with almost zero success, tried to exploit its soft power. There's actually called a Cool Japan program that is about the uncoolest thing in the world, because the minute a bunch of politicians tell you something is cool, that's the minute it becomes really, really uncool, And Korea, I think the Korean government is flirting with that to a certain degree, but I think they're kind of clumsy at it too, because politicians aren't cool. They don't know what the next hit song is going to be. So, K-pop is churning along really well by itself and will continue to. I think it's also benefited from the fact, we talked a little bit about it in the karaoke section. J-pop is something that was not really well exportable because it was meant to be easily sung by Japanese people who speak a different language. And also, it's being consumed in a totally different way over there. It's being controlled by different systems, and not much of it was ever exported. They really like to control the flow of it online to YouTube and things like that. So most people didn't have much exposure to J-pop at all. And that's why one of the other big reasons why K-pop took off so much. One more. Who's going to be the lucky? Well, way in the back.
Would you say there's like reciprocal romanticism of like Japan and America in the sense, like I'm thinking of how Japanese culture is infatuated like with brands like Nike. So would you say there's like a reciprocal romanticism between the two?
I'm going to, yes. The end. No, I'm going to give you a perfect example here. So up on the right, this is a giant robot character called Gundam. Okay? Gundam's name doesn't sound very Japanese at all. He was actually named because the director of the show saw a commercial starring Charles Bronson dressed as a cowboy who was advertising a Japanese brand of I don't know, like cologne or hair tonic or something. He slapped in his face and said, Mandem. And he's like, wow, what a great name. I'm going to take this. This cowboy guy is saying it. And so he kind of tweaked it and made it Gundam. So this is an example of how Japan, in a very specific way, is looking abroad to the West. Japan had a love affair with cowboy movies in the 1960s and 70s, with American folk, with American rock, and all of that has been plugged in. Like Haruki Murakami probably wouldn't exist without American hard-boiled literature. Anime wouldn't exist without Western cartoons. One of the great things Japan does is they see something and they're like, man, I want that. And then they make something for themselves that's based on it, and then we stumble across it and think it's something totally fresh and new. It's a really great trick if you can pull it off. Yes?
You could insert that as that meme from the Suicide Squad, then, of he does exactly what I do, but better.
Yes, exactly. Well put. So I think as much. Well, what a great image to end on, huh? This is like a.
Please join me in thanking Matt Alt.
Thank you. Thank you.